Dolly was just feeling ready to go to bed when Anna came in her night costume. All that day Anna had more than once been on the point of speaking intimately, but each time, after saying a few words, she had put it off, saying, "By and by, when we are alone, we will talk. I must tell you everything." Now they were alone, and Anna did not know what to talk about. She sat by the window looking at Dolly, and casting over in her mind that inexhaustible store of topics which she had wished to talk about, and yet she could not find one to begin with. It seemed to her as if she had already told all that was in her heart to tell. "Well, what about Kitty?" asked Anna, sighing deeply and looking guiltily at Dolly. "Tell me the truth, Dolly. Is she angry with me?" "Angry? No," answered Dolly, smiling. "Doesn't she despise me?" "Oh, no. But you know this is one of the things people don't forgive." "Yes, yes," said Anna, turning away and looking out of the open window. "But I was not to blame. And who is to blame? And what is there blameworthy about it? Could it have been otherwise? Now tell me, how do you think? Could you have helped being Steva's wife?" "Truly, I don't know. But you must tell me." "Yes, yes, but finish telling me about Kitty. Is she happy? They say her husband is an excellent man." "That's too little to say, that he's excellent. I don't know a better man." "Oh, how glad I am. I am very glad. Little to say that he is an excellent man," she repeated. Dolly smiled. "But now tell me about yourself," said Dolly. "I want a long talk with you. I've talked with—" She did not know what to call Vronsky. It was awkward to call him either Count or Alexey Kirillovitch. "With Alexey," said Anna. "Yes, I know that you talked with him. But I wanted to ask you frankly what you think of me, of my life." "How can I tell you at such short notice? I don't know what to say." "No, you must tell me. You see my life. But you must not forget that you see us in summer with people, and we are not alone. But we came in the early spring. We lived entirely alone, and we shall live alone again. I ask for nothing better than living alone with him. But when I imagine that I may live alone without him, absolutely alone, and this would be—I don't see why this may not be frequently repeated, that he may spend half of his time away from home," she said, and, getting up, she sat down close by Dolly. "Oh, of course," she said, quickly interrupting Dolly, who was about to speak. "Of course I cannot keep him by force. I don't keep him. To-day there's a race, his horse's race. He goes. I am very glad. But you think of me. Imagine my situation. What is to be said about it?" she smiled. "But what did he talk with you about?" "He spoke about a matter which I myself wanted to talk over with you, and it is easy for me to be an advocate of it. About this, whether it is not possible or essential to—" Darya Alexandrovna hesitated. "To improve. Make your position legal. You know how I look at— But anyhow, if possible, a marriage must take place." "You mean divorce," said Anna. "Do you know, the only woman who came to see me in Petersburg was Betsy Tverskaya. Perhaps you know her. Au fond c'est la femme la plus depravée qui existe. She had a liaison with this Tushkevitch, deceiving her husband in the most outrageous way. But she told me that she did not wish to know me, because my position was illegal. Don't think that I compare. I know you, dear heart, but I could not help remembering it." "Well, what did he say to you?" "He said that he suffered both for you and for himself. Maybe you will say that is egoism, but what an honorable and noble egoism. He wishes to make his daughter legitimate, and to be your husband, and with a husband's rights." "What wife, what slave, could be more of a slave than I, in my position?" she interrupted angrily. "The main reason that he wishes it is that you may not suffer." "This is impossible. Well?" "Well, to make your children legitimate, to give them a name." "What children?" said Anna, not looking at Dolly, but half closing her eyes. "Ani, and those that may come to you." Oh, he can be easy. I shall not have any more." "How can you say that you won't have any more?" "Because I will not have any more." And in spite of her emotion, Anna smiled at the naive expression of astonishment, of curiosity, and horror depicted on Dolly's face. "After my illness, the doctor told me—" "It is impossible!" exclaimed Dolly, looking at Anna with wide opened eyes. For her this was one of those discoveries, the consequences and deductions of which are so monstrous that at the first instant it touches only the feeling, that it is impossible to grasp it, but that it rouses momentous trains of thought. This discovery, which explained for her how happened all these hitherto inexplicable families of one or at most two children, stirred up so many thoughts, considerations, and contradictory feelings that she could not say a word, but only gazed with wide opened eyes of amazement at Anna. It was the very thing of which she had dreamed, but now that she knew it was possible, she was horror struck. She felt that it was a quite too simple solution of a too complicated question. "N'est-ce pas immoral?" she asked, after a moment's silence. "Why? Remember that I must choose between two things, either being pregnant, that is to say, sick, or being the friend, the companion of my husband, for so I consider him. If that is a doubtful fact to you, it is not so to me," said Anna, in an intentionally superficial and frivolous tone. "Yes, yes, but," exclaimed Darya Alexandrovna, hearing the very same arguments which she had brought up to herself, and no longer finding in them their former weight. "For you, for other women," proceeded Anna, apparently divining her thoughts, "there may be some doubt about this, but for me, just think, I am not his wife. He will love me as long as he loves me, and how, by what means, am I to keep his love? It is by this," and she put out her white arms in front of her beautiful body. With extraordinary rapidity, as always happens in moments of emotion, all sorts of thoughts and ideas went rushing through Darya Alexandrovna's mind. "I have not tried," she reasoned, "to attract Stiva to myself. He deserted me for some one else, and the first woman for whom he sacrificed me did not retain him by being always pretty and gay. He threw her over and took another. And will Anna be able to fascinate and retain Count Vronsky? If that is what attracts him, then will he be able to find women who dress even better and are more fascinated and merry-hearted? And however white, however beautiful her bare arms, however beautiful her rounded form and her animated face framed in her black hair, he will be able to find still better, more attractive women, just as my abominable, wretched, and beloved husband has done." Dolly made no reply and only sighed. Anna remarked this sigh, which signified dissent, and she proceeded. She had in reserve still more arguments, still stronger and impossible to answer. "You say that this is immoral, but this requires to be reasoned out," she went on saying. "You forget my position. How can I deserve children? I don't say anything about the suffering, I am not afraid of that. But think what my children will be. Unfortunate beings, who will have to bear a name which is not theirs, by their very birth compelled to blush for their father and mother." "Well, this is the very reason why a divorce is necessary." But Anna did not hear her. She wanted to produce the same arguments by which she had so many times persuaded herself. "Why was the gift of reason bestowed on me, if I cannot employ it in preventing the birth of more unhappy beings?" She looked at Dolly, but without waiting for an answer she went on. "I should always feel my guilt toward these unhappy children. If they do not exist, they will not know misery. But if they exist and suffer, then I am to blame." These were the same arguments that Darya Alexandrovna had used to herself, but now she listened and did not understand them. She said to herself, "How can one be culpable with regard to non-existent existences?" And suddenly the thought came, "Could it have been possibly any better if my darling Grisha had never existed?" And it struck so unpleasantly, so strangely, that she shook her head to chase away the cloud of maddening thoughts that came into her mind. "No, I do not know. I believe it wrong," she said, with an expression of disgust. But you must not forget that you and I, and moreover," added Anna, notwithstanding the wealth of her own arguments and the poverty of poor Dolly's, seeming somehow to recognize that this thing was immoral after all, "you must not forget the main thing, that I am not now in the same position as you are. For you the question is, do you wish to have more children? But for me, do I desire them? This is the principal difference. You must know that I cannot desire them in my position." Darya Alexandrovna was silent. She suddenly became aware that such an abyss separated her from Anna, that between them certain questions existed on which they could never agree, and which had best not be discussed. "That shows all the more necessity for legalizing your position, if possible." "Yes, if possible," answered Anna, in an entirely different tone, calm and sweet. "Is a divorce entirely impossible? They tell me your husband has consented." "Dolly, I do not wish to talk about this." "Well, we will not," Darya Alexandrovna hastened to say, noticing the expression of suffering on Anna's face. "Only it seems to me that you look too much on the dark side." "I? Not at all. I am very happy and contented. You saw, je fais de passion with Veslovsky." "Yes, to tell the truth, Veslovsky's manner displeases me very much," said Darya Alexandrovna, willing enough to change the conversation. "Oh, but there's nothing. It tickles Alexey, and that's all there is of it. But he is a mere boy, and entirely in my hands. You understand? I do as I please with him, just as you do with your Grisha." "Dolly," she suddenly changed the subject, "you say that I look on the dark side. You can't understand. This is all too terrible. I try not to look at all." "You are wrong. You ought to do what is necessary." "But what is necessary? You say I must marry Alexey, and that I don't think about that. I not think about that!" she exclaimed, and the color flew over her face. She got up, straightened herself, and began walking up and down the room with her graceful gait, stopping now and then. "Not think about that! There is not a day or an hour when I do not think of it, and blame myself for thinking of it, because the thought of it will make me mad. Will make me mad," she repeated. "When I think of it, I cannot go to sleep without morphine. But very good. Let us speak calmly. You talk about divorce, but in the first place, he would not consent. He is now under the Countess Lydia's influence." Darya Alexandrovna, reclining in an easy chair with a sympathetic and sorrowful face, watched Anna as she walked up and down. She shook her head. "We must try," said she. "Suppose I should try? What does it mean?" she asked, evidently expressing a thought which she had gone over in her own mind 1,000 times and had learned by heart. "It means that I, who hate him, and who have nevertheless confessed my guilt to him, I believe in his magnanimity, that I humiliate myself to right him. Well, suppose I make the effort, suppose I do it. I shall receive either an insulting answer or his consent. Good, I get his consent." Anna at this time was in the farthest end of the room, and stopped there to arrange a window curtain. "I get his consent. But my son, you see he will not give him to me. No, he will grow up despising me, living with his father whom I have left. Just think, I love these two almost equally, both more than myself. These two, Seroza and Alexey." She advanced to the middle of the room and stood in front of Dolly, pressing her hands to her breast. In her white peignoir, she seemed wonderfully tall and large. She bent her head, and, looking out of her moist, shining eyes on the little, homely, lean Dolly, sitting there in her darned nightgown and nightcap, all a tremble with emotion, went on. "These two only I love, and the one excludes the other. I cannot bring them together, and yet this is the one thing I want. If this were not so, it would be all the same. All the same. It would end in some way. But I cannot. I will not talk about this. So do not despise me. Do not judge me. You, in your purity, could never imagine what I suffer." She sat down beside Dolly and, with a guilty expression in her eyes, took her hand. "What do you think? What do you think of me? Do not despise me. I do not deserve that. I am miserably unhappy. If there is any one unhappy, it is I," said she, and, turning away, she began to weep. After Anna left her, Dolly said her prayers and went to bed. She pitied Anna with all her soul while she was talking with her, but now she could not bring herself to think of her. Memories of home and her children arose in her imagination with new and wonderful joy. So dear and precious seemed this little world to her that she decided that nothing would tempt her to stay longer away from them, and that she would leave the next day. Anna, meantime, returning to her dressing room, took a glass and poured into it several drops of a mixture containing chiefly morphine, and, having swallowed it, she sat a little while motionless, then went with a calm and joyous heart to her bedroom. When she went into her sleeping room, Vronsky looked scrutinizingly into her face. He was trying to discover some trace of the talk which he knew by the length of her stay in Dolly's room she must have had with her. But in her expression, which betrayed a certain repressed excitement, as if she were trying to conceal something, he found nothing except the beauty to which he was so accustomed, and which always intoxicated him, and the consciousness of it and the desire that it might still have its useful effect on him. He did not like to ask her what they had been talking about, but hoped that she would herself tell him. But she only said, "I am glad you like Dolly. You do, don't you?" "Yes, I've known her for a long time. She's a very good woman, mais excessivement terre à terre. But still, I am well pleased at her visit." He gave Anna another questioning look and took her hand, but she understood his look in another way and smiled. The next morning, in spite of repeated urging from her hosts, Darya Alexandrovna prepared to go away. Levin's coachman, in his old kaftan and a sort of postilion's cap, put the unmatched horses into the old carriage with its shabby harness, and, looking stern and resolute, drove up the sanded driveway to the covered portico. Darya Alexandrovna took a cold farewell of the Princess Bavara and the gentleman. The day that they had passed together made them all see clearly that they had no interests in common, and that they were better apart. Anna only was sad. She knew that no one would waken again in her the feelings which Dolly had aroused in her soul. To have these feelings aroused was painful to her, but still she knew that they represented all the better side of her nature, and that soon all vestige of such feelings would be stifled by the life that she was leading. As soon as she got fairly away from the house, Darya Alexandrovna experienced a pleasant feeling of relief, and she was about to ask her men how they liked the Vronskys, when suddenly the coachman, Philip, himself spoke out. "They're rich enough, but they give only 3 measures of oats. The horses cleaned it all up before cockcrow. What are 3 measures? Only a bite. Nowadays oats cost only 45 kopecks. With us, we give our visitors' horses as much as they will eat." "A stingy baron," said the bookkeeper. "Well, but you liked their horses, didn't you?" asked Dolly. "The horses? Yes, they were all right, and the food was good. But still, somehow I felt kind of homesick, Darya Alexandrovna. I don't know how it was with you," said he, turning to her his good, handsome face. "Yes, and so did I. But do you think we shall get home this evening?" "We must get home." On reaching home, and finding everyone perfectly happy and glad to see her, Darya Alexandrovna, with great liveliness, told the story of her trip and how warmly she had been received, about the luxury and good taste of the Vronskys' establishment, and about their amusements, and she would not allow anyone to say a word against them. "You must know Anna and Vronsky, and I know him better than I did, to appreciate how kind and affectionate they are," she said with perfect sincerity, forgetting the vague feeling of discomfort that she had felt when she was there. Vronsky and Anna passed the rest of the summer and part of the autumn in the country under the same conditions, and took no steps toward getting a divorce. It was agreed between them that they should not make any visits, but they both felt that the longer they lived alone, particularly in the autumn, and without guests, the more unendurable became their life, and that they must have some change. Nothing which constitutes happiness was apparently wanting to them. They were rich, young, well, they had one child, and they had pleasant occupations. Though they had no guests, Anna continued to take the greatest care of her person and her dress. She read much, both in the way of novels and of serious literature, and sent abroad for valuable books which she saw praised in the foreign magazines and journals. And she read them carefully, as one can do only when in the solitude of the country. Moreover, all subjects which interested Vronsky she studied up in books and scientific journals, so that often he went directly to her with questions relating to agronomics and to architecture, even with those on the breeding of horses and the best methods of hunting. He was amused at her knowledge and her memory, and when he felt any doubt about the beginning of an enterprise and wanted moral support, he would consult her, and she would find in books whatever he asked about, and then show it to him. The arrangement of the hospital also occupied her. She not only assisted in it, but, moreover, invented many original ideas and carried them out. But, after all, her chief preoccupation was herself. Herself, and how she might retain Vronsky's affections, how she might supply for him all that he needed. Vronsky appreciated this, and saw that the only aim of her life was to please him and to obey his wishes in every particular. But at the same time he was oppressed by the chains of tenderness which she tried to forge around him. As time went on, he found himself more and more embarrassed by these chains, and more desirous of, if not exactly escaping them, of at least keeping them from interfering with his independence. If it had not been for his ever-increasing desire for freedom, if it had not been for the fact that every time he had to go to the city, to the races, there was a scene with Anna, Vronsky would have been perfectly contented with his existence. The rôle of rich landed proprietor, which he had chosen for himself as constituting the true work of the Russian aristocracy, and which he had been engaged in now for half a year, gave him ever-increasing pleasure. His work, which absorbed him more and more, was prospering admirably. Notwithstanding his enormous expenses for the building of the hospital, for machinery and cattle imported from Switzerland, and many other things, he felt sure that he was not wasting, but increasing, his property. As far as it concerned the matter of income, the sale of wood, of wheat, of wool, the leasing of land, Vronsky was as firm as a rock, and succeeded in holding to his price. In matters concerning his whole management, both on this and on his other estates, he kept to the simplest and least risky processes, and was to the highest degree economical and prudent in all details. Notwithstanding all the cleverness and shrewdness of his German superintendent, who tried to involve him in purchases, and who so managed every calculation that a large outlay was needed at first, but where, by waiting a little time, the same thing could be done much cheaper and with greater profit, Vronsky used his own judgment. He would listen to his superintendent, would ask him all sorts of questions, and consent to his proposed plans only when the thing to be imported or constructed was something perfectly new, unheard of as yet in Russia, and calculated to cause surprise. Moreover, he would decide to embark in large enterprises only when he had plenty of money on hand, and in entering on any such outlay he attended to all the details, and insisted that he should have the very best results. Thus it was evident that in carrying out his undertakings he was not dissipating, but was increasing, his estate. In the month of October, the government of Kashin, in which were situated the estates of Vronsky, Sviatsky, Koznouyshev, and a part of Levin's, was to hold its nobiliaria elections. These elections, for many reasons, and because of the persons who took part in them, attracted general attention. Much was said about them, and great preparations were made for them. People from Moscow, Petersburg, and even from abroad, who had never witnessed an election, came to look on. Vronsky had some time before promised Sviatsky to go with him. Just before the elections, Sviatsky, who had often visited Voznesenskoye, came after Vronsky. On the evening before this event, Vronsky and Anna almost had a quarrel about his proposed trip. It was getting autumnal in the country, a melancholy, gloomy time, and therefore Vronsky, already ready for a contest, announced with a cold, stern expression, such as he rarely allowed himself toward Anna, that he was going away on this expedition. But to his surprise Anna received the news with entire calmness, and only asked him when he should be back. He looked at her scrutinizingly, not understanding her calmness. She smiled as he looked at her. He knew her power of retiring into herself, and he knew that it was manifested only when she was planning something about herself and did not wish him to know her plans. He was afraid of this now, but he was so desirous of avoiding a scene that he almost forced himself into believing that her manner was sincere. "I hope you will not be lonely." "I hope so too," said Anna. "I received a box of books from Gautier yesterday. No, I shall not be lonely." "She is adopting a new tone, and so much the better," thought he. "But it is all the same thing." And so, without entering into any frank explanation with her, he started off for the elections. This was the first time since the beginning of their liaison that he had left her without full and complete explanation. In one way this disquieted him. In another he felt that it was better so. "At first there will be something as there is now, not altogether clear and above board, but after a while she will get used to it. At all events," he thought, "I can give up to her everything except my independence as a man." In September Levin returned to Moscow for Kitty's confinement. He had already been there a whole month without anything to do, when Sergey Ivanovitch, who had an estate in the government of Kashin, and who took great interest in the approaching elections, was getting ready to make the journey. He took with him his brother, who had a parcel of land in the Selesnevsky district, and who, moreover, had some very important business to transact in regard to a trusteeship, and the receipt of certain money in Kashin in behalf of his sister, who lived abroad. Levin was even at the last moment in a state of uncertainty, but Kitty, seeing that he was bored in Moscow, not only urged him to go, but without his knowledge bought him a noble's uniform at the expense of 80 rubles. And these 80 rubles paid out for the uniform constituted the chief reason which induced Levin to go. He therefore went to Kashin. He had been at Kashin 6 days, present at every session of the electors, and employing himself in his sister's affairs, which did not progress at all satisfactorily. All the marshals of nobility were absorbed in the elections, and it was impossible to accomplish the very simple business which depended on his guardianship. The other matter, the receipt of some money, in the same way caused him great delay. After long parleyings concerning the removal of an interdict, the money was ready to be paid over, but the notary, a most obliging man, could not deliver the paper because the signature of the president was necessary, and the president, neglecting his duties, was at the sessions of the nobles. All these annoyances, this wandering from place to place, these talks with very pleasant good men who thoroughly appreciated the disagreeable position of the petitioner but could not help him, all this endeavor which brought no result, produced on Levin's mind a most painful impression, analogous to that tormenting impotence which one sometimes experiences in a nightmare when one wants to employ physical force and is unable to do so. He frequently experienced this when talking with the most obliging of men, the solicitor. This solicitor, it seemed, was doing everything in his power and was exerting all his mental energies to get Levin out of his difficulties. "Try this way or that way," he would say, "or go to this place or to that place," and the solicitor would lay out a whole plan for avoiding the fatal obstacle that stood in the way. But immediately he would add, "Still there is delay. However, try it." And Levin would go flying off in this direction or that, and doing whatever he was told to do. All were good and kind, but it seemed as if the obstacles, even after he had passed them, kept growing up again and cutting off his path. Especially annoying was it to him that he could never know with whom he was really contending, for whose profit it was that he could never bring his business to a conclusion. And no one seemed to know this either. Not even the solicitor knew this. If Levin could have understood, as he understood why it was impossible to get at the office of a railway otherwise than by standing in line, it would not have been humiliating and vexatious. But, as regarded the obstacles that stood in his way, no one could tell him why they existed. But Levin had greatly changed since his marriage. He had learned patience, and if he could not comprehend why all this was arranged as it was, then he told himself, since he did not know all about it, he was not in a position to judge, and that apparently it was unavoidable, and he strove not to lose his temper. Now that he was present at the elections, he endeavored not to be severe in his criticisms, nor to enter into controversies, but as far as he could to understand the matters which excellent and honorable men whom he thoroughly respected found so serious and so absorbing. Since his marriage Levin had opened his eyes to so many new and serious sides of life which had hitherto seemed to him, in his superficial view of them, of no great importance, that now in the matter of the elections he looked for a serious significance, and found one. Sergey Ivanovitch explained to him the idea and significance of the change which was proposed to the electors. The governmental predvoditelь, or marshal of nobility, had charge of very many matters of public importance, as, for example, guardianships, such as the one which Levin himself was now trying to bring into a satisfactory shape, and large sums of money, and the direction of the gymnasia, or schools for women, and for the peasantry, and the military, and the training of the people for their new duties, and finally of the zemstvo, or popular assembly. Now the present marshal, Snetkov, was a man of the old aristocratic stamp, who had squandered an enormous property, was a very worthy and honorable man in his way, but wholly incapable of comprehending the new needs of the present time. He always on every occasion took the side of the nobles. He always cast the whole weight of his influence against the extension of popular education, and he gave the zemstvo, which was coming to have such an enormous significance, a partisan character. It was considered necessary to put in his place a new and active man, imbued with the most enlightened modern ideas, and to manage the business so as to extract from all the rights given to the noblesse, not as the noblesse, but simply as a constituent part of the zemstvo, such advantages of self-government as were possible. In the rich government of Kashin, which always took the lead in every advance, such forces were now concentrated that the business now before the assembled nobles would be likely to set an example for all the other departments, indeed for all Russia, and therefore the business had a great importance. It was proposed to elect as marshal, instead of Snetkov, either Sviatsky, or, still better, Nelyadovsky, a man of eminent understanding, formerly a professor, who was an intimate friend of Sergey Ivanovitch's. The Sombrany, or provincial assembly, was opened by a speech from the governor, who urged the nobility to elect the necessary functionaries, not from partisan reasons, but for merit and for the public weal, and he hoped that the nobility of the department of Kashin would do their duty, as they had always done, and thus deserve their monarch's confidence. Having finished his speech, the governor left the hall, and the noblemen, tumultuously and eagerly, and some of them even enthusiastically, followed him, and surrounded him while he was putting on his shuba, and talking in a friendly way with the government marshal. Levin, anxious to see everybody and miss nothing, was in the midst of the throng, and he heard the governor say, "Please tell Marya Ivanovna that my wife is very sorry, but she had to go to the asylum." Then all the nobles gaily took their shubas and went in a body to the cathedral. In the cathedral, Levin, together with the rest, raised his hand and repeated after the protopope the solemn oaths by which they swore to fulfill their duties. The church service always impressed Levin, and when he joined with this throng of men, old and young, in repeating the words, "I kiss the cross," he felt stirred. On the second and third day the assembly was occupied with the moneys meant for the education establishments for the nobility and for women, which Sergey Ivanovitch declared had no especial importance, and Levin, who had his own business to attend to, was not present. On the fourth day the verifying of the government accounts came up, and here, for the first time, the new party came into direct collision with the old. The commission, whose duty it was to verify these accounts, announced to the assembly that the money was all accounted for. The government marshal arose, and with tears in his eyes thanked the nobility for their confidence in him. The nobles loudly congratulated him, and shook hands with him. But at this time one noble belonging to Sergey Ivanovitch's party declared that he had heard that the commission, for fear of affronting the government marshal, had not properly performed the verification of the accounts. One of the members of the commission unguardedly admitted this. Then a very small and very young-looking, but very sarcastic, gentleman began to say that it would probably be agreeable for the government marshal to give an account of his expenditures, and that the excessive delicacy of the members of the commission had deprived him of that moral satisfaction. Thereupon the members of the commission withdrew their report, and Sergey Ivanovitch began logically to prove that it was necessary to acknowledge that the expenditures had been verified or that they had not been verified, and he went into a long exposition of the dilemma. A chatterer from the opposite party replied to Sergey Ivanovitch. Then Sviatsky spoke, and was followed by the sarcastic gentleman. The proceedings were tedious, and no end was reached. Levin was surprised that they discussed this so long, and all the more because, when he asked Sergey Ivanovitch whether Snetchkov was suspected of peculation, he replied, "Oh, he's an honest man, but we must shake this old-fashioned patriarchal way of managing business." On the fifth day occurred the election of the district marshals. The session was a stormy one for many of the districts. In the Uzet, or district of Zelenevskoye, Sviatsky was unanimously elected by acclamation, and he gave a grand dinner the same evening. The principal election, that of marshal of the government, did not take place until the sixth day. The great halls and the little halls were crowded with nobles in their various uniforms. Many came for this day only. Acquaintances who had not met for years were there, some from the Crimea, some from Petersburg, some from abroad. The debates were carried on at the governor's table, under the emperor's portrait. The nobles both in the larger and the smaller hall were grouped in opposing camps, and, judging by the hostile and mistrustful looks exchanged, by the conversations which ceased at the approach of strangers, by the fact that some walked up and down in the distant corridor whispering together, it was evident that each side had secrets from the other. Even by a superficial glance it could be seen that the nobles were divided into two sharply contrasting types, the old and the new. The old school wore for the most part either old court uniforms, tightly buttoned up, with swords and ancient hats, or else their ordinary marine, cavalry, or infantry uniforms of very ancient date. The uniforms of the old nobles were made in the ancient style, with epaulets on the shoulders and with short waists and tight armholes, as if their possessors had grown out of them. But the younger men wore court uniforms with broad shoulders, long waists, and white waistcoats unbuttoned, or else uniforms with black collars and embroidered laurel leaves, the distinguishing badge of the Ministry of Justice. Court uniforms were to be seen here and there, also among the young men, adding to the brilliancy of the throng. But the division into old and young did not coincide with the party lines. Some of the younger men, to Levin's surprise, belonged to the old party, and on the contrary, some of the oldest nobles were on confidential terms with Sviatsky and were evidently warm partisans of the new school. In the smaller hall, where men were smoking and lunching, Levin was standing near a group of his friends and listening to what was said, and vainly exerting all his intellectual powers to comprehend what was said. Sergey Ivanovitch was the center around whom many men had gathered. He was now listening to Sviatsky and Kaluistov, the marshal of another district, who belonged to their party. Kaluistov would not agree to go with his district, and begged Snetchkov to stand as candidate. But Sviatsky advised him to do this, and Sergey Ivanovitch approved of this plan. Levin could not understand why a party opposed to this marshal and wanting to defeat him should nevertheless put him up as a candidate. Stepan Arkadyevitch, who had just been lunching and drinking, joined them in his chamberlain's uniform, wiping his mouth with a perfumed and embroidered cambric handkerchief. "We hold the situation," said he, arranging both his side whiskers. Sergey Ivanovitch." And after he heard Sviatsky's plan, he agreed with him. "One district is enough, but let Sviatsky pretend to be in opposition." And all except Levin understood the meaning of his words. "Well, how is Kostya?" he said, turning to Levin and taking him by the arm. "So you came, it seems, in style." Levin would not have been sorry to be in style, but he could not comprehend what was taking place, and, going a few steps from the rest, he expressed to him his astonishment at seeing the hostile districts asking the old marshal to stand as candidate. "Oh, sancta simplicatus," replied Vronsky, and in a few clear words he explained to Levin what the state of the case was. If, as at the last elections, all the districts should unite on the government marshal, he would be elected. This is not what is wanted. Now 8 of the districts have agreed to ask him to stand, but if 2 should refuse to accept him for their candidate, then Snetkov might decline to stand, and then the old party might take for their candidate someone else in their party, so that the whole scheme would be defeated. But if Sviatsky's district is the only one refusing to adopt him as their candidate, Snetkov will accept the nomination. So he is selected and proposed as a candidate, so as to throw dust in the eyes of the opposite party, and when we set up our candidate, they will go over to him." Levin began to get some idea of the plan, but it was not entirely clear to him, and he was about to ask a few more questions, when suddenly there was heard from the next room a great shouting and uproar and confusion. "What is it? What? Who? Confidence in whom? What? It is disproved. Lack of confidence. They won't admit Flerov. Prosecution. They refuse to admit a man? Shame! The law!" Such were the words that Levin heard shouted from all sides, and he, together with all the rest, hurrying from all directions and shouting at the top of their voices, rushed into the great hall, and, pressing along with all the nobles, he made his way up to the governor's table, about which the government marshal, Sviatsky, and other leaders were hotly discussing. Levin stood at quite a distance. A noble breathing stertorously near him, and another with thick, squeaking soles, prevented him from hearing distinctly. All he could distinguish was the marshal's gentle voice, then the sharp voice of the sarcastic gentleman, and then the voice of Sviatsky. He could only distinguish that they were disputing about the meaning of a clause of the law and the meaning of the words "Nachodivshayose pod saisviam." The crowd parted to let Sergey Ivanovitch get to the table. Sergey Ivanovitch, after waiting till the sarcastic gentleman was done speaking, said that it seemed to him it would be a better way to consult the law itself, and he asked the secretary to find for him the text of the law. The law said that in case of divergence of opinion a vote must be taken. Sergey Ivanovitch read the clause, and was just beginning to explain its meaning when he was interrupted by a tall, stout, round-shouldered proprietor, with dyed whiskers, and wearing a tight uniform with a high collar which seemed to prop up the back of his head. This man came up to the table and, striking it with his fist, shouted at the top of his voice, "Put it to the ballot! Vote on it! No discussing! The ballot!" Then suddenly a number of voices broke out at once, and the tall noble, still pounding with his fist, grew angrier and angrier, and shouted louder and louder. But it was impossible to make out what he was talking about. He said the same thing as Sergey Ivanovitch had proposed, but evidently he hated Kozneushchev and his whole party, and this feeling of hatred communicated itself to the whole party, and called forth the opposition of similar, though more decorous, hatred from the other side. Voices were raised, and for a moment everything was in confusion, so that the government marshal was obliged to call for order. "Put it to a vote! Put it to vote! Put it to vote! The man knows what he is talking about. There'll be bloodshed. The emperor's confidence. Don't count the marshal. He's not our prikazchik. That's not the point. Please put it to vote. It's odious," were the exclamations heard on every side in angry, violent tones. Eyes and faces became still angrier and more violent, with words of irreconcilable hatred. Levin did not understand at all what the trouble was, and was amazed at the passion with which they discussed the question whether they should vote or not vote on the opinion concerning Flerov. He forgot, as Sergey Ivanovitch afterward explained to him, the syllogism that for the common weal it was necessary to elect a new government marshal. To defeat the present marshal a majority of the votes was needed. To get a majority of the votes it was necessary to give Flerov the right of voting. To pronounce Flerov qualified it was necessary to have it decided how the clause of the law was to be understood. One vote may decide the whole matter, and we must be serious and logical if we wish to act for the public good, said Sergey Ivanovitch in conclusion. But Levin forgot this, and it was trying for him to see these excellent men, for whom he had such respect, in such a disagreeable and angry frame of mind. In order to avoid this feeling, he, without waiting for the end of the election, went into the smaller hall, where there was no one except the servants connected with the buffet. Seeing the servants busily engaged in polishing the service and putting away the plates and glasses, seeing their contented, lively faces, Levin felt an unexpected feeling of relief, just as if he had come out from an ill-smelling room into pure air. He began to walk back and forth, watching the servants. It pleased him greatly to watch one of the servants, an old man with gray side-whiskers, expressing his scorn for the younger ones who stood in awe of him, teaching them the best way of folding napkins. Levin was just about to engage the old servant in conversation, when the secretary of the assembly, a little old man, who made a speciality of knowing all the nobles of the province by their full names, came to call him. "Excuse me, Konstantin Dmitrich," he said. "Your brother is asking for you. The opinion is to be voted on." Levin went into the hall, took a little white ball, and, following close behind Sergey Ivanovitch, he went to the table where Sviatsky was standing with an important and ironical air, running his beard through his hand and occasionally putting it to his nose. Sergey Ivanovitch put his ball into the ballot box and made room for Levin. But Levin, having entirely forgotten what the voting was for, was disconcerted and asked his brother, "Where shall I put it?" He spoke in a low tone, and there was talking near him. He hoped that his question would not be overheard, but the speakers stopped and his unfortunate question was heard. Sergey Ivanovitch frowned and replied sternly, "That is a matter entirely of conviction." A number of the bystanders smiled. Much embarrassed, Levin quickly cast his vote, and as he happened to hold it in his right hand, he threw it into the right-hand receptacle. Only after he had deposited it did he remember that he ought to have put it in his left hand, and he did so, but it was already too late, and growing still more confused, he hastily made his way to the very rear rank. 126 in the affirmative, 98 in the negative, announced the secretary, who could not pronounce the letter R. Then a laugh went round. A button and 2 nuts were found in the ballot box. The questionable noble was admitted and the new party was victorious. But the old party did not even yet acknowledge itself defeated. Levin heard them request Snetkov to stand as their candidate, and he saw a throng of nobles surrounding the government marshal, who was making an address. Levin went nearer. In reply to the nobles, Snetkov was speaking of the confidence which the nobility had reposed in him, of their love for him which he did not deserve, because all his service had consisted in his devotion to the nobility whom he had served for 20 years. Several times he repeated the words, "I have served to the best of my ability. I appreciate your confidence, and I thank you for it." And then, suddenly pausing because of the tears which choked him, he hurried from the room. His tears arose either from the injustice that had been done him, or from his love for the nobles, or, possibly, from the unpleasant position in which he was placed, finding himself surrounded by enemies. But his grief was contagious. The majority of the nobles were touched, and Levin felt sorry for him. At the door the government marshal stumbled against Levin. "Excuse me, I beg your pardon," he said, as to a stranger, then, recognizing him, he smiled a melancholy smile. It seemed to Levin that he wanted to say something, but was prevented by his emotion. The expression of his face and his whole figure in his uniform, with his crosses and white pantaloons ornamented with galloon, as he hastened out, reminded Levin of some hunted animal which sees that it has little chance to escape. This expression in the government marshal's face went to Levin's heart. For only the day before he had been to see him about the guardianship affair, and had seen in the whole establishment the dignity of a good-hearted domestic gentleman. The large house, with ancestral furniture, unstylish, dirty, but dignified. Old servants who had evidently been former serfs and had not changed their master. The wife, a tall, benevolent lady in her lace cap and Turkish shawl, caressing her lovely granddaughter. The youngest son, a boy in the 6th class of the gymnasium, who had come in to wish his father good morning and kiss his big hand. The imposing but affectionate greetings and gestures of the master of the house. All this had awakened in Levin involuntary respect and sympathy even then, and now he felt touched and sorry for the old man, and wanted to say something pleasant to him. "Perhaps you will be our marshal again." "I doubt it," said Snetkov with a scared look. "I am tired, getting old. There are younger and better men than I. Must let them take my place." And he disappeared by a side door. Now the most solemn moment had arrived. It was necessary to proceed immediately to the election itself. The leaders of both parties were counting on their fingers the white and black balls. The controversy regarding Flerov gave the new party not only one more vote, but also gained time, so that they could send for 3 nobles, whom the trickery of the old party was going to deprive of the possibility of taking part in the election. 2 nobles who had a weakness for wine had been made drunk by Snetkov's henchmen, and a third had been seduced by the promise of a uniform. Having learned about this, the new party made haste during the contest concerning Flerov to send an izvozchik for the noble and to provide him with a uniform, and to bring one of the 2 drunken nobles to the hall. "I brought one of them. I had to douse him with water," said the proprietor, who had gone in search of him, addressing Sviazhsky. "He'll do." "He's not very drunk, is he? Can't he stand?" asked Sviazhsky, shaking his head. "Yes, he's a young man. Only don't let them get him to drinking here. I told the caterer not to give him any wine under any consideration." The narrow hall, where men smoked and had luncheon, was crowded with nobles. The excitement kept increasing, and all faces showed signs of anxiety. Especially agitated were the leaders, who knew all the details and had followed the voting very closely. These men had charge of the approaching engagement. The others, like the soldiers in the ranks before the battle, although ready for the conflict, in the meantime sought diversion. Some ate luncheon, standing or sitting at the buffet. Others walked up and down the long room smoking cigarettes and talking with friends whom they had not seen for long. Levin did not feel hungry, he did not smoke, and he did not care to join his friends, that is, Sergey Ivanovitch, Stepan Arkadyevitch, Sviazhsky, and the others, for the reason that Vronsky in his equerry's uniform stood in lively conversation with them. The evening before he had seen Vronsky at the election and had carefully avoided him, not wishing to come into contact with him. He went to a window and sat down, watching the groups and listening to what was said around him. He felt depressed, especially because all the others, as he could see, were animated, active, and occupied, and he alone was inert and indifferent. The only other exception was an old man in a naval uniform, who had no teeth and who spoke in a mumbling voice. "What a rogue! I told him it was not so. He can't make it up in 3 years," a round-shouldered, short proprietor was saying energetically. This man, whose long unpomaded hair was spread out over the embroidered collar of his uniform coat, walked along, noisily putting down the heels of his new boots, which evidently had been made for the elections. But as he caught sight of Levin he cast a hostile glance at him and turned about abruptly. "Yes, it is a nasty thing to say so," repeated the little proprietor in a piping voice. Immediately behind these 2 came a whole throng of proprietors, crowding around a tall general, and quickly approaching where Levin was. They were evidently trying to find some place where they would not be overheard. "How does he dare say that I ordered his trousers to be stolen? He drank them up, I reckon. I don't care a straw if he is a prince. Don't let him dare to say such a thing. It's swinish." "Hold on, excuse me. They insist on the letter of the law," they were saying in another group. "His wife must be inscribed among the nobility." "The devil take the letter of the law. I insist on its spirit. According to that they are genuine nobles, believe me." "Your Excellency, let us come. Fine champagne." Another group immediately pressed behind a noble who was shouting something at the top of his voice, This was one of the 3 drunken nobles. "I always advised Marya Semyonovna to let it on lease because she gets no profit out of it," a proprietor was saying in a pleasant voice. The man had grey whiskers and wore the uniform of a colonel in the old general's staff. It was the same proprietor whom he had once met at Sviazhsky's house. Levin immediately recognized him. The proprietor also glanced at Levin, and they greeted each other. "This is very pleasant. How are you? I remember you very well. We met last year at Nikolai Ivanovitch's, at the marshal's." "Well, how goes your farming?" asked Levin. "Everything is going to rack and ruin," said the proprietor, halting near Levin and looking at him with a submissive smile, but with an expression of calmness and confidence that this was the natural order of things. "But how does it happen that you are in our part of the world?" he asked. "Did you come to take part in our coup d'état?" he went on, pronouncing the French words with confidence, but with a bad accent. "All Russia is assembled here. The chamberlains, if not ministers." He pointed to Stepan Arkadyevitch's imposing figure, as in white trousers and chamberlain's uniform he strode along next to the general. "I must confess to you," said Levin, "I don't understand the significance of these noblemen's elections." The old gentleman looked at him. "Well, what is there to understand? What significance can they have? It's a decaying institution which prolongs itself by the force of inertia. Look at all these uniforms. They tell you this is an assemblage of justices of the peace, perpetual councillors, and so on, but no noblemen." "Why, then, do you come?" "From habit, to keep up relations, from a sort of moral obligation. And then, if I must tell the truth, I come on a question of personal interest. My son-in-law wants to be elected as a perpetual councillor. He's not rich. I must try to help him. But why do such people as that come?" And he pointed out the orator whose sharp voice had struck Levin during the debates at the governor's table. "It is a new generation of nobles." "Certainly new, but not nobles. They are landholders, but we are the proprietors. But they are trying to get the power as if they were nobles." "Yes, but you say it is a decaying institution?" "Decaying or not decaying, it must be treated more respectfully. Even though Snetkov, we may not be worth much, but nevertheless we have lasted 1,000 years. Suppose you lay out a new garden before your house, and there happens to be a century-old tree which has grown up on your land. Though the tree is old and gnarled, you don't have it cut down, but you lay out your walks and your flower beds in such a way as to preserve intact the old oak. You can't grow such a tree in 1 year," he said, cautiously, and immediately changed the conversation. "Well, how do matters go with you?" "Not very brilliantly. 5%. "Yes, but you don't reckon your own time and labor. Now, I will tell you about myself. Up to the time when I began to take care of my own estate, and when I was still in the service, I used to receive 3,000 a year. Now I work harder than when I was in the service, and I also get about 5%, and I am lucky if I get that. And all my time and trouble are thrown in." "But why do you do it if the results are so unprofitable?" "Yes, why do I? What shall I say? Habit. And because I know it has to get done. I will tell you something besides," continued the proprietor, leaning his elbow on the window seat and falling into a tone of monologue. "My son has no taste for farming. He is evidently going to be a scholar, so there'll be no one to carry on after me. And yet one goes ahead. Here, I have just planted a garden." "Yes, yes," said Levin, "you are quite right. I am always conscious that there's no real economy in my farming, but still I go on with it. But one feels that one owes a certain duty to the land." "Now I will tell you another thing," continued the proprietor. "A neighbor, a merchant, came to see me. We went over the farm and then the garden. 'Well, Stepan Vasilyevitch, this place is in order,' said he, 'but your garden has too much shade.' But he found it in order, mind you. 'My advice would be to cut down those lindens, just for the bark. Here are 1,000 lindens. Each one will make 2 excellent basts, and basts sell well. If I were you, I should cut some of that linden trash down and sell it.'" "Yes, and with the money he would buy cattle, or perhaps a bit of ground cheap, and he would lease it to the peasants," said Levin, with a smile, for evidently he had more than once come into contact with similar cases. "And so he makes a fortune. But you and I thank God if we keep our land, and are able to leave it to our children." "You are married, I have heard?" "Yes," replied Levin with proud satisfaction. "It is wonderful. We live without making any profit, obliged, like ancient vestals, to watch some holy fire." The old gentleman smiled under his white mustache. "Some people, like our friends Sviazhsky and Count Vronsky, pretend to make something by agriculture. But so far they have only succeeded in eating into their capital." "Why shouldn't we imitate the merchants, and cut down the trees in our parks, and make money?" asked Levin, reverting to the idea which had struck him. "Just this, because we guard the sacred fire, as you say. Besides, that is not the business of the nobles. And our work as nobles does not lie here, at these elections, but at home, each in his own place. It is not a caste instinct that tells us what is necessary or not necessary. The muzhiks have theirs. A good muzhik will persist in hiring as much land as he can, no matter how bad it is, he will work it just the same, even without profit." "We are all alike," said Levin. "I am very glad to have met you," he added, seeing Sviazhsky approaching. "Here we have met for the first time since we were together at your house," said the proprietor to Sviazhsky. "Yes, and we have been having a talk." "And doubtless have been slandering the new order of things?" said Sviazhsky, smiling. "Something of the sort." "One must free one's mind.